Hola, muy buenas tardes, sean bienvenidos al Circo Político. Le mandamos un saludo a nuestra audiencia que nos escucha en Plaza Borregos y en Prepa Esmeralda. El día de hoy me encuentro con Sam Ortigosa, que está en operación. Sam, ¿cómo estás?
Estoy muy bien de estar aquí con ustedes hoy y bienvenidos.
Gracias. En la mesa conmigo se encuentra Charlie, Josué, Carlos y yo, Monse. Estamos muy emocionados porque este programa es especial, pero no les daremos más spoilers. Quédense con nosotros.
Entérate en Cortina.
Y bueno, arrancamos con la noticia municipal. Y bueno, el día martes 30 de octubre, miembros de la presidencia municipal de Atizapán de Zaragoza visitaron en su gimnasio a los pugilistas locales que ganaron un total de 8 medallas en el torneo Sur-Sureste Monte Albán 2024, que contó con la participación de 500 boxeadores de 18 estados de México. Sin duda, el deporte del boxeo se constituye como uno de los preferidos de la juventud en este municipio, y se vio reflejado con los resultados obtenidos por Jocelyn Méndez, Nancy Valderas, Kenny Omar Cruz, quienes obtuvieron el oro en diferentes categorías.
En el apartado estatal tenemos que el día 28 de octubre la Fiscalía del Estado de México comunicó que el 24 de octubre en el municipio de Lerma fue detenido José Enrique N., alias El Nariz, en un operativo por posesión de arma de fuego y delitos contra la salud. El sujeto fue categorizado como el operador más importante en el Valle de Toluca del grupo delictivo La Familia Michoacana. Su relación con el grupo se vinculó dado que trabajaba para el H1, también conocido como el Flaco, quien es hermano de Johnny y Alfredo Hurtado Olascuaga, líderes del cártel. Dentro de sus actividades delictivas hay registros de extorsión, distribución y venta de sustancias ilícitas, tala clandestina, violencia y privación de la vida, entre otras operaciones. Esta, junto con la captura horas más tarde de jefes de plaza del cártel, son parte de las medidas de la Fiscalía junto con la Secretaría de Seguridad y Sedena que están tomando para cortar los canales de la organización.
Ahora con la noticia nacional. Este 30 de octubre, el Senado recibió las cartas de renuncia de 8 de 11 ministros de la Suprema Corte, que serían efectivas a partir del 31 de agosto de 2025, conforme a la reciente reforma judicial. Ministros como Norma Piña, Margarita Ríos Farjat y Alfredo Gutiérrez han renunciado para evitar el pase automático a la elección de 2025. Ríos Farjat anunció que no aceptará su pensión vitalicia, y Piña expresó que su renuncia es un acto de respeto constitucional, aunque no está de acuerdo con dejar el cargo. El presidente del Senado, Gerardo Fernández Noroña, sugiere que el Senado podría no aceptar estas renuncias.
En temas internacionales, Google ha sido multado por Rusia por reiterar canales de televisión rusos de YouTube. La cifra alcanzó un monto de 2.5 billones de dólares este 31 de octubre. Esta cifra alcanzó un nivel sin precedentes en los últimos 4 años desde que se inició el proceso judicial. Algunos expertos han dicho que Google claramente no pagará esta multa y la Federación Rusa no podrá recuperar este dinero de la empresa. La sanción original en 2020 era de $1,000 y desde entonces se ha ido multiplicando. Bueno, esas fueron las noticias de la semana, pero quédense con nosotros porque en el próximo bloque vamos a estar hablando sobre las elecciones en Estados Unidos, con un invitado muy especial. Nos vamos a una pausa musical y regresamos.
Y estamos de regreso aquí en el Circo Político. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. En mesa me encuentro con Sara, Pedro y con nuestro invitado especial, el profesor Bill. Sara, ¿cómo te encuentras hoy?
Muy bien, muy feliz y muy nerviosa, la verdad, pero será un buen programa.
Pedro.
Igual muy emocionado y nervioso, pero sé que va a salir bastante bien.
Profe, ¿cómo se encuentra el día de hoy?
Excelente, gracias por tenerme aquí y feliz Día de los Muertos.
Ay, muchas gracias. Pues bueno, aquí vamos a hacer un poquito de cambio. Vamos a iniciar con el programa en inglés en nuestra primera edición. And well, we're back, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. And as the United States gear up for another presidential elections, the stakes are high, and the world is watching closely. So in today's segment, we will dive into the electoral process. But first, I would like to introduce our guest today, Bill Gelfeld, that is a professor of political Science and International Relations at Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Monterrey, teaching courses on global challenges, foreign policy, and international organizations, among others. Bill earned his PhD in policy analysis from Part Ranch Graduate School, and his dissertation research focused on preventing term limit deviation in low and middle income democracies. Prior to working at Tech, he has a professor in International Relations at Universidad de San Francisco de Quito in Quito, Ecuador, for 3 years. Prior to obtaining his PhD, Bill worked in emergency and disaster relief for the NGO Catholic Relief Service in Haiti and Central Africa Republic, Niger, Cameroon, and Dominican Republic. He holds master's degrees from Johns Hopkins University, Stanford University, and the University of Texas at San Antonio, and the bachelor's degree from Duke University. His research interests include comparative governance, democratic backsliding, international development, and food security, among others issues. So, with the coming election, it is crucial to understand why these events matter, not just to Americans, but to people around the world. So, firstly, we will start from the beginning and ask you, how does the U.S. election process work?
Sure. Well, the U.S. is different than a lot of other countries around the world. Here in Mexico and in many countries, you have a Central Electoral Commission, like INE here in Mexico. We don't have that in the United States and never have. Elections in the U.S. are run by the individual states. So there are good elements of this and there are bad elements of this. The good, I suppose, if you want to call it that, is that it's very hard to commit wide-scale electoral fraud because you have 50 different state electoral commissions. And if in a foreign country, let's say Russia, wanted to interfere in our election, they would have to interfere 50 different times. They couldn't hack one database and change the votes. So it's good from that perspective, but it's bad in that some states do not really respect or value voter rights and representation as much as others do. And so that leads to things like gerrymandering. You might have heard that term. Gerrymandering means you can design districts within your states to benefit certain groups of voters over others. Traditionally, that has been white voters over minority voters in the United States for our history. And we have discriminated against minorities and against poor people. You might ask the question, why is our election on a Tuesday? Well, it's actually in the Constitution, but why haven't we moved it to a Sunday? That would be much more pro-poor, especially when people don't have the weekdays off. And so there are a lot of things about the system of the U.S. electoral process which are not ideal.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, and that's why we wanted to dedicate this first part of the program to explain how the electoral system works, because we are used to a whole weekend dedicated to a single election, even if it's a presidential election or a midterm elections every 3 or 6 years, and it's really interesting what you're saying about that. It's established in the Constitution. And well, I also want to ask Sarah if she has something to ask for this.
Yes, I think that trying to understand how elections work is something quite complex. I think you won't let me lie that we could have a whole program trying to understand and how does they work. But also, I think that one point that is very important are the polls, which are a critical information management, and more so for us who have seen this whole electoral process from abroad. But still, Professor, how do you also see the role that polls play in the United States elections?
Sure. Well, I mean, polls in any country establish expectations, right? You look at the polls to guide you to see where the public is, to see what you think is going to happen. Now, polls have margins of error. Margins of error tell you how wrong they might be. You know, in 2016, the polls were quite off. They were a bit outside the margins of error. Everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win going into that night, and obviously Donald Trump won. So the polls are only as good as the people conducting them and also the people answering them. Do you guys answer your phones a lot when you get an unknown number?
No.
No, not usually. Not usually. It's not very common.
No, neither do I. So if pollers aren't on your phone, right? They're not a recognized caller. So who is picking up these calls? And I wonder about the quality of these polls when no one answers their phone anymore. So less people answering their phone, smaller sample sizes, worse polls. Now they try to correct for that, obviously, but that depends on a lot of factors, the quality of those polls. Those polls can be intentionally or unintentionally skewed, right? Obviously, there are political polls that want to say certain things, and there are polls that try to get it right. But again, if you're only paying attention to the skewed polls, then your expectations are likely to be wrong. There are a lot of people out there who are convinced that either Trump or Harris are going to win. And the people on the Trump side, we know, have committed electoral violence before. So if you're convinced that Donald Trump is going to win because all of your polls that you're looking at are telling you that, well, that could very well lead to post-election violence. So those polls are important. They can't tell you what's going to happen. They can only tell you to set your expectations.
Yeah, and we can also online, us in here in the other side of the country, what are the expectations of the public? Right now, I think that Kamala is like with a little bit of difference from Trump, but at the beginning when she started with a huge difference. Oh, well, not a huge, but a little bit more difference from Trump that right now. So the expectations can move on while the electoral process is like moving also, no? And Pedro, I don't know if you want to.
Yes, as you're saying, Mafer, it's has been a really convulsed electoral process in the United States. And first with Joe Biden's dropout of the electoral campaign after the first debate, and then Vice President Kamala Harris taking on the spot for the Democrat candidate. And Professor, I wanted to ask you, what are the most important issues in the current electoral campaign?
Well, that really depends who you ask, right? Obviously, if you ask somebody more on the left or somebody more on the right, they might tell you very different issues. I think on the left, abortion remains at the top of the agenda, women's rights and women's bodily rights, the economy, and climate change would probably be what they would say. On the right, they would probably say immigration would be at the top of their agenda. Also, the economy is still important. And gender issues, they bring up these trans rights, bathroom issues, which are more cultural issues. For me, it's democracy and the rule of law. It's our standing and reputation in the international community. It's our willingness as Americans to adhere to our alliances and the promotion of international democracy and development. Really, to me, this election boils down to, are we going to be an inward-looking country, or are we going to be an outward-looking country? Is it America first, or is it an internationalist view? And this is the contest, I think.
Yes, and as you said, for example, the BBC put 3-point kings to understand the voters' preference. The first of them is the economy, showing that the most of the citizens vote with their wallet, and that was something that for me was very important. The second one is the migration, as you said, and we can see the different position that they have, like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and the other is the migration that has the same case as the as the other. But some of these uses will be taken up later, so I don't want to get or make any spoilers. So stay with us. We will take a musical break, and in the next block, we are going to talk about who is Donald Trump.
So we are back in another segment focused on one of the most talked about figures in American politics, Donald Trump. As a former president and current candidate, Trump's campaign has sparked a mix of strong support, controversy, and debate on issues ranging from economic policies to immigration, and foreign relations. With all of that, I am wondering, why did the Republicans choose Trump as their candidate again?
We actually had a chance on January 6th. After January 6th, they impeached Trump, of course, but they failed to convict him. If they had convicted him, he could not have run again, but they didn't. And so he is the candidate again. I would say he has a very dedicated following. Some might say cult-like among the Republican Party. I think The first time he ran, it was clear the establishment Republicans did not want him to win. They wanted Jeb Bush or another more traditional candidate to win, and they did everything they could to prevent him. But he won. He got this following. And so while the party establishment doesn't like him and would like to get rid of him, hardcore Republicans do like him. They like what he says. They like the way he talks. And so, they had, as I said, they had that chance. But I think, unfortunately, the Republican leaders were too cowardly. And Mitch McConnell, the then Senate Majority Leader, to stand up and say, no, this was wrong, like they did in Brazil. Bolsonaro cannot run again because he launched an effective coup. And they prevented him. But Donald Trump can because he was not convicted after he was impeached. A lot of people think impeachment is being found guilty. No, impeachment is a trial. And that trial then goes to the Senate, and you have to be convicted by 66% of the Senate. He wasn't. And so he's allowed to run again.
Yes, and also for me it's something like very surprising to see how, despite the legal accusations against him, he continues to be very well accepted by the population. And this has not been something that has held him back, but together with his determination, his nationalism, and other things that you have also mentioned, have empowered him. And for me, that's something very, very surprising.
And just before the next intervention, we would like to hear a little audio about some declarations of Donald Trump.
We're taking advantage of us, as they all do, to protect the American worker and to open foreign markets, and we did a great job. I ended NAFTA, the worst trade deal ever made in the history of our country, and replaced it with the USMCA, perhaps the best trade deal ever made in history. That's Mexico and Canada. I stood up to China like no one else before me. No one came even close. And I saved the U.S. auto industry from obliteration.
Well, after hearing this public speech of Donald Trump, I would like to ask you, what are the main objectives of Donald Trump's foreign policy, especially regarding Mexico and the Latin America region?
Well, in regard to the USMCA, he negotiated that. It shouldn't change much. NAFTA and USMCA are not that different, as Trump might claim. His philosophy is really America first, and it's a zero-sum game approach. It's an us versus them mentality. It's you could call it, his economic approach is mercantilist, really 19th century, both diplomacy and global economics. He has said that he wants to impose really significant tariffs on all imports to supposedly boost American manufacturing. That's a very mercantilist view. If you boost your manufacturing, it hurts other people. This would result in massive inflation for American consumers. It would hurt American consumers. It would hurt the poor the most because inflation does. They're the people who can least afford to pay higher prices, and would lead other nations to retaliate if he did that. This could potentially cause a global recession, and most economists have come out against this plan as very potentially damaging. We've seen that Trump prefers dictators. He prefers to deal with Putin, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, to Democrats. That's troubling to me as someone who believes in democracy. And I'm worried about our alliances. I worry that he will undermine NATO. I worry that he's very transactional in his approach and his philosophy, that he believes he needs to get something out of every interaction rather than just supporting our allies because of shared values.
Yeah, and also, during his presidency, Trump also promised to deport all the immigrants living in the country illegally. But, we know that he didn't. So the immigration experts also, tell that it's the focus of his also presidency promises, right? All of the immigration situation, also with Mexico and what is happening, but also what happened right now with Claudia Sheinbaum in the power. We know that Trump, if he wins, it's a little bit complicated here with Claudia Sheinbaum, because we all know that maybe Trump doesn't like a lot women, so it will be a little bit complicated, and more because we know that we are in this battle of really the diplomatic relations with Mexico, so it will be a little bit complicated right now. So
Yes, and taking into account another topic that is important, what did you see are the biggest challenges he faces in terms of public perception, and how he has worked to overcome them?
I think the biggest challenge he faces is that people perceive him as a fundamental danger to democracy in the United States and the rule of law. Certainly that's what Harris is running on. She's saying, look, he is dangerous. He tried to subvert democracy the first time. He tried to launch a coup on January 6th. He'll do it again, only this time, he won't have guardrails in place because he will put people into positions to enact his policy. So I think that's the biggest challenge he faces. How has he tried to overcome it? He hasn't. I mean, you hear what he says. He says, I'll just be a dictator on day one. He says that he admired Hitler's generals. This is not the talk of somebody who's trying to, other people who worked for him have called him a fascist. His former chief of staff, John Kelly, said he thought that he was a fascist. So he's not really trying to work around these. He says whatever he thinks, and that's part of his appeal. That's part of what people like about him, is they feel that he speaks his mind, but he's not trying to dispel these images of him being a potential dictator, of him not caring about the rule of law, of him not caring about norms. And so I don't think he's really trying to do anything, which is why he's so polarizing. To the people who like him, they love him, and they love that they think he's honest and he's coarse and whatnot. And the people who don't like him, the people who oppose him, think, yeah, listen to what he's saying. He's saying he'll be a dictator. He's saying he will go after his opponents. He's saying he will use the U.S. government to prosecute other elected officials like Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff, which has never been done before in U.S. history. That's unprecedented.
Yeah, as you were saying, there is no a midterm with Donald Trump. Either you're with him or you are against him. A little question I wanted to ask you, also related to the foreign policy. Sorry for returning to this topic about the foreign policy and the international agreements. Do you think that that the ODS agreements can be jeopardized if Donald Trump gets back to power?
Looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, we're already not on track to meet them. We're already way off track, and there are several reasons why. That was one of your exam questions.
Yeah.
The COVID pandemic put us way behind the ball. We're not putting the necessary resources to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and we don't have the necessary international cooperation. In regard to all of those, do we think that Donald Trump is going to be good for them? Do I think Donald Trump will be good for international collaboration? He pulled out funding for the World Health Organization during a pandemic. He had one of the most disastrous COVID responses of all countries. More Americans died than almost any other country. I mean, it depends whose statistics you believe in. So no, I don't think that we'd be better off with Donald Trump and the Sustainable Development Goals, because he has proven he's not an internationalist. He's not going to give the necessary funding to the UN, to the necessary UN organizations to achieve them, and he doesn't believe in a lot of, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality, environmental goals, these are not things that he cares about. So no, I don't think that we would make significant progress under his leadership towards the SDGs.
Well, yes, and also as we were talking about a little bit earlier about this type of backsliding of the United States, right? As we know, if Donald Trump wins, what will happen to the democracy in the United States? It will be a little bit worse, or what do you think about it, of if Donald Trump won?
So I'm working on a paper on just this topic, on democratic backsliding in the United States, specifically looking at gender backsliding. And I think we've seen a lot of damaging evidence from his first term. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, all of whom ruled to get rid of abortion rights. I think that's going backward in terms of gender progress. I think you can look at a lot of other things. He does not respect the rule of law. There has been demonstrated democratic backsliding, and this isn't just my opinion. This is in the data. If you look at the worldwide governance indicators, if you look at if you look at Freedom House, they will tell you that the United States has gone backward as a democracy during the years of Trump. Now it's gotten a bit. We've had almost 4 years of Biden. There's time to recover, but some of that damage is long lasting. Trump appointed more judges than I want to say any other president in U.S. history. Those judges, and he intentionally appointed them young, especially the Supreme Court justices, so they will be there for decades, ruling on different kinds of precedent. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's dangerous for democracy.
Yeah, well, as we all have noticed, it is like a little bit warning to us as Mexico and also different countries, but also because the United States have been like a democracy that starts from the beginning of the times, you know. And now as Mexico, we are a new democracy. So right now it's a little bit worry for us and for other countries to know that the United States is backsliding like that.
Of course, the United States is an example, or theoretically an example. It hasn't always been a great example, but other countries have looked to it. If you look at most democratic constitutions around the world, they're based on the U.S. Constitution. And so the U.S. example is important. U.S. aid funding is important. Democracy funding is important. And if we don't set that example, then it allows other countries to fall by the wayside, or they're going to pay more attention to other countries who will give them aid, like China, who doesn't care about democratic principles.
Yeah, of course. Well, we are running out of time, so we are going to a musical pause right now, and we will come back with Kamala. And who is Kamala Harris right now? So we're back in our last segment, turning our attention to Vice President Kamala Harris, a central figure in the current administration. But first, I would like to ask you about the Electoral College. What is about the Electoral College?
Sure, we have this weird quirk in the United States in our electoral system where we don't vote directly for the president. We actually vote for electors. And as I said before, each state runs its own elections. So we vote in a certain state. Whoever wins that state gets all of the electoral votes from that state. So each state is apportioned a certain amount of electors based on their population. And when you win, California is the biggest state by population. They have the most electors. All of those states' electors then go to the president. And you need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. And it's going to be very tight this year. So we'll see. So you don't actually directly vote for the president. You vote for an elector who then votes for you. That raised some issues in the last election. Hopefully it won't in this coming election where people will vote for who they are supposed to. But we'll see how that plays out. I would like to see a national popular vote like you have here in Mexico. That makes more sense. Everyone vote counts the same. Right now, because California has a certain amount of electoral votes, but it's not entirely proportional to the population. Wyoming, the smallest state, your vote actually matters more as somebody in Wyoming than somebody in California. So I would like to see that change to a national popular vote, but we'll see if that comes in the future.
Well, turning our attention right now to Kamala Harris. Thank you, Bill, for tell us about the Electoral College. But right now, Kamala Harris is one of the most closely watched leaders in the United States political landscape. And as the first female, Black, and South Asian vice president, Harris has broken new grounds, but she's also facing unique challenges and high expectations right now. So let's hear some declarations of Kamala first.
So all of this is to say, I will always put the middle class and working families first. I come from the middle class, and I will never forget where I come from. So I just outlined for you a little bit about my plan. Now let's talk about Donald Trump. Well, he has a very different plan. Take, for example, Project 2025. Just Google it.
Well, and now that we have listened to Kamala Harris, I would like to ask you, how has Kamala Harris' role evolved since she became vice president?
So when she was vice president, they didn't really give her a lot to do. She didn't really shine or stand out, and she was perceived to be kind of behind the scenes. They gave her immigration, possibly the most difficult issue to deal with. So I don't think that she stood out. While a VP, however, after she was given the nomination, she's really come into her own. She's surprised a lot of people by how well she campaigned. She's been criticized for not being as available to the media. She didn't give a lot of interviews initially. She hasn't maybe been as transparent as some people would like about her policies, but people have liked her energy, have liked her positivism. And she has, you mentioned when she entered the race, Biden was several percentage points behind former President Trump. Kamala Harris pulled into the lead. Then Trump in recent weeks overtook her. And I believe, depending on the polls you read, the collection of polls, it seems that Harris has pulled ever so slightly ahead in the latest polls. But it's really a toss-up. It's a coin flip. It's a 50-50 proposition. So we'll see. But, she has been, I think, fairly impressive as the candidate.
Yes, and well, as we were mentioning before, the transition from Joe Biden to being the original candidate for a second presidential term in the United States from 2024 to 2020 has been he dropped out from the election, and now the most it can be considered that the most the best option for the Democratic Party was Vice President Kamala Harris, and also, as you were saying, she in her vice presidential role, he was not like the most media figure. She has stood out now in this electoral process, and after the first debate with Donald Trump, her popularity grew up a lot. And so I wanted to ask you, what is your point on the transition from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris?
I think it was a very necessary transition. Did any of you watch that debate between Joe Biden and former President Trump?
Yes.
It was very discouraging.
We discussed it here in the program.
Yeah, I think for those of us, and I'm a Democrat, I will, full disclosure, I was pretty depressed afterwards. And I think that whether you think so or not, the perception is that Joe Biden was too old for the job. And if that was the perception of the majority of voters, a change need to be made. He was going to lose the election, whether on merit or whether on perception. So you needed somebody with more youth, more energy, more vitality to invigorate the Democratic Party, to invigorate their voters, to get them to want to come out. Democrats tend to do better when there's high voter turnout. Republicans do better when there's lower voter turnout, which is why they suppress the vote. She has achieved this. She has energized the Democratic Party. She has energized the base. Now, there are still schisms. There are still splits within the Democratic Party. We have seen younger, especially male-female. I was listening to a podcast just yesterday, Fareed Zakaria, talking about how young males are increasingly going right and young females are increasingly going left. And you're also seeing this with young black men and young Latinos in the United States as well. Not in massive numbers, but enough possibly to shift the election. So we'll see about these demographics and how they tend to influence the election.
And I think that this transition from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, as you said, it was a very important news for everybody. Consider that Joe Biden was already a candidate, but looking at the debates and the way that he reacted to the president of Donald Trump, it was something that we also talked about in previous programs. And also, it was new that, similarly, a few days ago, Joe Biden said that the only trash are his supporters of Donald Trump, referring to Donald Trump, and he says that they didn't represent her, because we need to know that sometimes when these parts has an idea, they don't represent like all the candidates. And she also talked about like the people that was there, that she wants to unify the country and try to diminish the effects of polarization in the country at the moment. So that's something that we can discuss also. But what do you think, Mafer?
Well, it's really interesting to talk about all of these situations, but I don't know, Pete, if you want to talk about something or ask Bill about something.
Also, like talking about like returning to this foreign policy and Kamala Harris' proposal about foreign policy. How do you think that she will handle the international agenda regarding issues like the actual Gaza-Israel conflict and also the Israel-Lebanon conflict and the Russia-Ukraine war that it's almost 3 years that it began?
Sure, I'll get right there to your question. The garbage comment that President Biden made was in response to a comedian warming up for Trump saying that Puerto Rico was a floating island of garbage. Now, if you're trying to attract the Latino vote, which the Republicans are, I don't know why you would say something like that. And yet these things come out of the Trump administration. Floating island of garbage, other comments. That was, I believe that was meant as a joke, but that's a terrible joke if it was such. And so the Trump campaign continues to stick its foot in its mouth on all of these issues and continues to polarize the country. Turning to foreign policy, how would a potential President Harris handle things differently than a return of a President Trump? Well, especially on Ukraine-Russia, that's probably the biggest difference. Because Trump has said he would probably pull out a lot of his support for Ukraine. J.D. Vance has certainly, his vice presidential candidate has said he would as well. The Harris campaign, Harris had said that she would continue support for Ukraine, which again, if you are a Democrat, a supporter of democracy worldwide, then I believe you think the Ukrainian cause is important, that standing up to tyrants like Putin is important, that setting that precedent that, the United States and its allies will support democracy, and will support democracy not only in words, but with funding and with, equipment as well. And so that is one major difference. Harris would stay the course that we've been on under President Biden, supporting Ukraine, whereas likely President Trump would pull out that funding, and would certainly, I think President Harris would be tougher with Putin. Trump seems to be best friends with Putin. So it also depends on Congress, because that fund, even if Harris wins the presidency, any continued Ukraine funding would have to go through Congress. If the Republicans control either the House or the Senate, that will be exceedingly difficult. With Israel and Palestine, I don't see as much of a difference between the two candidates' policies. Now, I think that Harris would push the Israelis harder for a ceasefire, for an eventual two-state solution for Palestine, whereas Trump had said to Netanyahu, I don't think you've even gone far enough. He said that to him, which is not something I agree with at all. And so, there certainly would be differences between the two there, but I think less differences because Biden has very strongly supported Israel, and Harris seems, at least in her campaigning, to be on the same track.
Yeah, and also, I think, that her husband is also Jewish, right? So, well, right now we are running out of time. I would like to continue talking about all these things, and also we will see what happened in the elections the next Tuesday. So right now we will switch to Spanish again to to say goodbye to everyone. So muchas gracias, profesor, por estar con nosotros el día de hoy. Estamos muy contentos de haberlo recibido aquí en nuestro canal El Circo Político. Y pues terminando con esto, quisiera informarle a la audiencia que el próximo martes estaremos haciendo cobertura de este gran evento en la Embajada de Estados Unidos. Entonces, pues sintonícenos en nuestras redes sociales, El Circo Político en Facebook y el circopolítico.sem en Instagram, también en Frecuencia SEM, que ahí es donde se va a estar transmitiendo. Y muchísimas gracias, nos vemos el próximo programa en punto de las 3. Este fue El Circo Político.